I can tell you the exact moment I realized I was going to die here, though it took me another 17 years to understand what that death would actually mean. It was my third rotation on the Undying Resolve, somewhere in the transit between Forge worlds whose names I never learned, when Senior Machinist Horvath took me down to sub-level 9 and showed me the thing we were supposed to keep alive. He didn't call it a reactor, not at first. He called it the heart, and when I asked him what kind of reactor it was, plasma core, fusion array, atomantic pile, he just looked at me with those wet, grey eyes of his and said, "It's the kind that works, and that's all the machine god requires you to know." I was young then, fresh from the Shola Technical on some forgotten orbital whose designation has long since been scrubbed from my memory by the years and the hum. 23 standard years old, cocky with my certifications in plasma dynamics and electromagnetic field theory, certain that my education had prepared me for anything the Mechanicus might throw at a contract laborer. I had aced every theoretical examination, performed flawlessly in the simulation temples, could recite the litany of ignition in 3 different dialects of technolingua. I thought I understood machines. I thought I understood the fundamental principles that made the Imperium's vast network of vessels and stations and forge complexes function. I was an idiot. The first thing you notice about the heart isn't what it looks like, but what it sounds like, and that sound never stops. Not for a single instant in all the years I've been down here. It's a hum that you feel more than hear, a vibration that starts in your back teeth and works its way down through your jaw, into your spine, spreading out through your bones until your entire skeleton resonates with it. Horvath told me I'd get used to it, that after a few months I wouldn't even notice it anymore. That was the first lie, though I don't think he meant it as one. You never get used to the hum. You just learn to forget what silence feels like, and eventually you start to wonder if it ever existed at all. If maybe the universe has always been filled with this low, grinding, persistent vibration and you were just too distracted by other things to notice it before. The chamber itself defies the geometric principles they taught us in the Shola. It's a sphere, or at least I think it's a sphere, though the dimensions seem to shift slightly depending on where you're standing and what time of the shipboard cycle it is. The walls are some kind of dark metal I can't identify. I've run every test I can think of on samples scraped from the surface, and the results are different every time, as if the composition is in constant flux. Sometimes the metal feels warm to the touch, feverish almost, radiating heat that has nothing to do with the thermal output readings on our instruments. Other times it's so cold that moisture from the recycled air freezes in delicate fractal patterns across its surface. Ice crystals that form symbols I almost recognize before they melt away. The heart itself sits at the center of all this, suspended in a framework of cables and conduits and support structures that seem to have grown as much as been built. I say sits, but that's not quite right either. It hovers, held in place by forces I cannot measure with any instrument in our possession, rotating slowly on multiple axes that shouldn't be geometrically possible. It's roughly cylindrical, about 15 meters long and 5 wide, its surface covered in panels and protrusions and symbols that hurt to look at directly. Some of the symbols are recognizable, here a cogwheel, there an equation that almost makes sense, but most of them are alien in a way that makes my stomach clench, arrangements of angles and curves that suggest meanings just beyond my comprehension. Horvath showed me the primary maintenance protocols that first day, walking me through the inspection routes, the measurement stations, the ritual observances that had to be performed at specific intervals. There were 47 separate checks that needed to be completed every shipboard day, each one documented in the maintenance log with precise timestamps and readings. Temperature at node 17, pressure differential across manifold 7, harmonic resonance in chamber theta. The list went on, a litany of numbers and observations that would become my entire existence. "What are we measuring?" I asked him, stylus poised over my data slate. "What do these readings tell us about the reactor's operational status?" He paused at that, one hand resting on a conduit that pulsed with a faint purple light. "We're measuring what we can measure," he said finally. "As for what it tells us," he shrugged, a gesture that seemed to cost him more effort than it should have. When the readings change too much or too fast, we report it to the tech priests. They make adjustments. The ship keeps moving, that's all that matters. But the theory behind it, I pressed. The operational principles. How does it generate power? What's the energy source? What happens if something goes wrong? Horvath turned to look at me then, really look at me, and I saw something in his expression that I would come to recognize in my own face years later, reflected in the polished metal surfaces that lined the corridors of Sub-Level 9. It was a kind of hollow resignation, a weariness that went deeper than simple fatigue. "Listen, kid," he said, and his voice was gentler than I expected. "You seem smart. You ask good questions. So I'm going to give you the only piece of advice that matters down here. Stop trying to understand it. Do the checks, record the readings, perform the rituals exactly as written, and don't think too hard about why. That's how you survive this. That's how you keep your sanity." I didn't listen, of course. How could I? I was a technician, trained in the scientific principles that underpinned the Imperium's machinery. Understanding was my job, my purpose, the thing that separated me from the mindless servitors that shambled through the ship's corridors on their assigned tasks. So I studied the heart, observed its patterns, tried to map its behavior against everything I had learned in the Schola. The first anomaly I documented occurred during my second week. I was performing the routine temperature check at Node 17, a sensor cluster on the starboard side of the containment sphere, when I noticed that the reading was 0.73 degrees higher than it had been at the same time the previous day. A tiny variation, well within normal operational parameters for any conventional reactor system, but I noted it anyway, recorded it in my personal log, along with atmospheric pressure, humidity levels, and the current phase of the ship's warp drive cycle. The next day, the temperature was up another 0.73 degrees. The day after that, another identical increase. I pulled up 2 months of historical data from the maintenance archives and found the pattern. Every 17-day cycle, Node 17's temperature would climb by approximately 0.73 degrees per day for 11 days, then drop by 8.3 degrees all at once, resetting to baseline. The precision was unnerving. Natural systems have variance, fluctuation, randomness. Even the most carefully calibrated machinery shows some drift over time. But this was exact, repeatable, like a clock ticking down to something. I showed my findings to Horvath, excited by what I thought was a breakthrough in understanding the heart's operational cycle. He looked at my charts and graphs, his expression growing more and more strained, and then he deleted the entire analysis from my data slate with 3 quick stylus strokes. "Don't," he said, and there was something close to fear in his voice. "Don't look for patterns. Don't try to predict it. Just record what you see when you see it and nothing more. But if we can predict the thermal cycles, we can optimize the cooling systems. Maybe improve efficiency. Efficiency isn't the point." He grabbed my shoulder, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "The point is that it keeps working. The point is that we don't draw attention to ourselves or to it. The point is that we do exactly what we're told, exactly how we're told to do it, and we don't ask why. Do you understand me?" I didn't understand him, not then, but I nodded anyway, and he released my shoulder and walked away without another word. That was the last piece of advice Horvath ever gave me. 3 days later, during the night shift, he walked into the heart's chamber without his protective gear, without his monitoring equipment, without following any of the prescribed safety protocols. They found what was left of him scattered across a 30-meter radius, pieces of flesh and bone and melted metal fused together into shapes that the Medicae servitors couldn't properly categorize. The official report listed it as an industrial accident, operator error, failure to observe proper safety protocols. His name was struck from the crew roster, and his belongings were incinerated as per standard procedure. I was assigned to work with machinist Kellen after that, a woman of perhaps 40 standard years who had been maintaining the heart for longer than I'd been alive. She was thin in a way that suggested her body was consuming itself from the inside out, her skin stretched tight over prominent bones, her eyes sunk deep in their sockets. She didn't talk much, which I learned to appreciate. We would move through our routines in near silence, the hum of the heart filling the spaces where conversation might have been, our footsteps echoing off the curved walls of the chamber in rhythms that never quite synced up with each other. Kellen taught me things that weren't in the maintenance manual, little tricks and observations that she'd accumulated over her years of service. She showed me how to tell when the heart was hungry, that's the word she used, by the way the symbols on its surface would pulse with a faint bioluminescence, cycling through colors that existed just at the edge of human perception. She taught me which conduits you could touch safely, and which ones would burn through your gloves and into the flesh beneath, and she never explained how she knew the difference because there was no visual distinction between them. She demonstrated the proper way to clean the sensor arrays, using a specific circular motion, always clockwise, always exactly 17 rotations, and when I asked why 17, she just looked at me with an expression that might have been pity. Because that's what works, she said, and I was learning that this was the only answer I would ever get to any of my questions about the heart. The ship's routine became my routine. Wake at 0500 hours shipboard time to the harsh clang of the alert klaxons, dress in the grey coveralls that marked me as maintenance crew, pull on the heavy boots that were supposed to protect against electrical discharge and thermal extremes, but never seemed to help much, descend through the levels of the undying resolve, past the crew quarters and the refectory, and the chapel where the ship's priest led morning prayers to the god emperor and the machine god in a hybrid liturgy that satisfied no one, down through the engineering sections, through the plasma conduit monitoring stations and the fuel storage bays and the auxiliary power generators that hummed along in their predictable, comprehensible way. Further down, past the security checkpoints where armed guards scrutinized our identification cards and scanned our retinas and patted us down for contraband we'd never been tempted to carry. Down to sub-level 9 where the heart waited. The inspection routine took approximately 11 hours to complete if you did it properly, following every step of the protocol without deviation. Node 17, check. Manifold 7, check. Chamber theta, check. 47 stations, each with its specific measurements and observations, each with its ritual recitations and gestures. Sometimes the readings made sense, falling within expected parameters for a large-scale power generation system. Other times they were nonsensical, impossible. Negative temperatures, pressure readings that implied the containment sphere was simultaneously evacuated and overpressurized, energy outputs that exceeded input by factors that violated fundamental thermodynamic principles. I recorded everything faithfully, stopped trying to make sense of it, let the numbers flow through me without interpretation. This is what the heart demands, I told myself. Observation without understanding, measurement without meaning. I became very good at not thinking about what I was seeing, at letting my hands move through the familiar motions while my mind floated somewhere else, somewhere far away from sub-level 9 and the hum that never stopped. The dreams started about 6 months into my service. I would find myself back in the heart's chamber, but everything was slightly wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The geometry would be even more distorted than usual, walls curving in directions that shouldn't exist, the floor tilting at angles that my inner ear insisted were impossible. In the dreams I could see inside the heart, past the panels and conduits, into a space that was larger than the exterior dimensions allowed. There were things moving in that space, shapes that writhed and pulsed and reached out toward me with appendages that were neither mechanical nor organic, but some third category that I had no words for. I would wake from these dreams with the hum still resonating in my bones, lying in my narrow bunk in the crew quarters, unable to tell if I was truly awake or still trapped in the nightmare. Sometimes I would find myself standing in the corridors outside my quarters, feet bare on the cold metal deck, with no memory of how I'd gotten there or how long I'd been walking. The other crew members would edge past me, eyes averted, pretending not to notice. I learned later that everyone who worked in sub-level 9 experienced something similar, that it was considered normal, just another hazard of the job like radiation exposure or high-pressure injuries. Kellen stopped coming to work about 8 months after Horvath died. One day she simply didn't show up for her shift, and when I checked the crew roster, her name had been removed. No explanation, no memorial service, no acknowledgement that she had ever existed. I asked around, carefully, obliquely, but no one would talk about it. The message was clear. People disappeared sometimes, especially people who worked too long in sub-level 9, and asking questions about them was a good way to disappear yourself. They assigned me a new partner, a young man named Vex, who had the same bright-eyed enthusiasm I'd had when I first arrived. He lasted 3 weeks before he started screaming during a routine inspection, clawing at his own face, insisting that he could see things moving beneath the surface of the heart, things with too many eyes and mouths that whispered his name. The security team dragged him away and I never saw him again. After that, they stopped assigning me partners. I worked alone, which was fine, better even. I didn't have to watch the gradual erosion of someone else's sanity, didn't have to see my own future reflected in their increasingly hollow eyes. The years blurred together after that, one shift bleeding into the next in an endless cycle of measurement and observation. I stopped leaving sub-level 9, except when absolutely necessary, taking my meals from the automated dispensers near the security checkpoint, sleeping in a small maintenance closet I'd converted into makeshift quarters. It was easier that way, easier than making the long climb back up through the ship's levels, easier than pretending to be part of the crew rather than something separate, something that belonged to the heart now. I began to notice things that the original maintenance protocols didn't account for, the way certain conduits would flex and contract in rhythms that seemed almost like breathing, the patches of organic-looking growth that would appear on the metal walls only to dissolve back into the surface when I tried to collect samples, the sounds that would echo through the chamber when the ship dropped out of warp transit, not mechanical sounds but something closer to whispers or distant screaming, always just at the edge of audibility, gone the moment I tried to focus on them. I documented everything in my personal logs, not because I thought anyone would ever read them, but because the act of recording gave me a sense of control, an illusion that what I was experiencing was comprehensible, quantifiable, real. I filled data slate after data slate with observations and measurements, stored them in a locked cabinet in my maintenance closet, a monument to pointless precision that no one would ever see. The tech priests came through occasionally, robed figures whose augmetics gleamed in the dim light of sub-level 9, their mechanical limbs clicking and whirring as they moved through their own inspection protocols. They never spoke to me, never acknowledged my presence, except to retrieve the data I'd collected and upload it to whatever archives they maintained. I tried to ask them questions once, early on, but they simply stared at me with their augmetic eyes and continued their work as if I hadn't spoken. I learned to stay out of their way, to make myself invisible, just another piece of equipment in the chamber, no more worthy of notice than the conduits or sensor arrays. It was during one of these tech priest inspections about 5 years into my service that I witnessed the only significant maintenance operation performed on the heart itself. 3 priests arrived, accompanied by a squad of Skitarii guards whose weapons tracked every shadow in the chamber, and they spent 6 hours doing something to one of the primary access panels. I watched from a safe distance as they removed the panel, revealing a space inside the heart that seemed to contain nothing. Not empty space, but an absence so complete that my eyes couldn't focus on it, a void that hurt to look at directly, like staring into a sun that produced darkness instead of light. The tech priests reached into that void with their mechanical appendages, manipulating things I couldn't see, their movements precise and ritualistic. Binary chant echoed through the chamber, prayers or commands or both, and the hum of the heart changed pitch for the first time since I'd been stationed here, dropping into a lower register that made my internal organs vibrate uncomfortably. When they finally replaced the panel and sealed it, I noticed that the symbols on its surface had rearranged themselves into new configurations, meanings I couldn't begin to guess at. After they left, I performed my normal inspection routine and found that several of my monitoring stations were now reading completely different parameters than before. Node 17, which had been measuring temperature, now appeared to be measuring something else entirely. The readings were in units I didn't recognize, cycling through values that might have been distances or pressures or electromagnetic wavelengths or none of those things. I updated my protocols to reflect the new readings, added them to my daily logs without comment or interpretation. This is what adaptation looks like, I told myself. This is how you survive. The ship's crew changed around me as the years passed, familiar faces cycling out, new ones cycling in, none of them staying long enough for me to learn their names, officers and ratings, technicians and servitors, all of them temporary except for me and the few other maintenance workers who haunted sub-level 9 like ghosts. We would pass each other in the corridors sometimes, these other servants of the heart, and we would nod in recognition but never speak. What would we have said? What common language existed for what we were experiencing? I started to notice changes in myself around year 7, small things at first, my hands moving through the inspection protocols before I consciously thought about what I was doing, my body navigating the chamber's peculiar geometry on pure instinct, finding handholds and pathways that I had no memory of learning. I would complete entire shifts and realize I couldn't remember any specific moment from them, as if I'd been sleepwalking through the routine, my consciousness disconnected from my actions. My reflection in the polished metal surfaces became harder to recognize. I was thinner, like Kellen had been, my flesh seeming to waste away despite the regular meals I forced myself to consume. My hair had gone gray, not gradually but all at once over the course of a few months, and when I looked at my eyes I saw something of that same hollow quality that had been in Horvath's gaze just before he died. I was becoming transparent, I thought, wearing away under the constant pressure of the hum and the impossible geometry and the accumulated weight of meaningless observations. The dreams evolved over time, became more vivid, more specific. I would find myself in conversation with the heart, though it never spoke in words I could understand. Instead, it communicated through sensation, pulses of heat and cold, changes in pressure, vibrations that formed patterns I almost recognized. Sometimes I would wake convinced that I'd learned something crucial, some fundamental truth about the heart's nature or purpose, but the knowledge would slip away before I could grasp it, leaving only a residue of unease and the persistent feeling that I had been told something terrible. Year 10 brought a crisis, though I understood it only through its effects rather than its cause. The ship dropped out of warp transit unexpectedly, alarms blaring throughout all levels, and suddenly sub-level 9 was full of people, tech priests and ship's officers and robed figures I didn't recognize, all of them swarming around the heart's chamber in controlled panic. I tried to continue my inspection routine, but a tech priest ordered me away, told me to wait in the corridor until the situation was resolved. I stood outside the chamber for 14 hours, listening to the raised voices and the sound of heavy equipment being moved around, the hum of the heart fluctuating wildly, rising and falling in pitch like a living thing in distress. At one point the lights failed completely, plunging the corridor into absolute darkness, and in that darkness I heard something that might have been screaming, or might have been laughter, or might have been the sound of reality itself tearing at the seams. When the lights came back on, the corridor was empty except for me. No tech priests, no officers, no mysterious robed figures, just silence, or what passed for silence here. The hum had returned to its normal pitch, steady and relentless. I entered the chamber cautiously, expecting to find damage or evidence of whatever emergency had prompted all the activity, but everything looked exactly as it had before. Same conduits, same panels, same impossible geometry. The only difference was a new symbol that had appeared on the heart's surface, one I'd never seen before, a spiral pattern that seemed to rotate even though I knew the metal was static. No one ever explained what had happened, and I knew better than to ask. I resumed my inspection routine, recorded my observations, performed my rituals. The ship continued its journey to wherever it was going, and I continued my service to the heart, and the years ground on. Around year 13, I realized I could no longer remember what my life had been like before the undying resolve. The Shola technical, my family if I'd ever had one, the worlds I'd seen before this assignment, all of it had faded into a blur of half-formed images that might have been memories, or might have been dreams, or might have been neither. All that existed was sub-level 9, and the heart, and the endless routine of measurement and observation. All that had ever existed, maybe. The idea that there was a world beyond these metal walls seemed increasingly abstract, a theoretical construct rather than a lived reality. My logs became more fragmented around this time, shorter entries with larger gaps between them. Sometimes days would pass without any entry at all, and then I would find myself with a stylus in hand, filling screens with observations I didn't remember making, descriptions of events I couldn't recall witnessing. The handwriting was mine, but the words seemed to come from somewhere else, as if something was using me as a recording device, transcribing information that had nothing to do with my own consciousness. One entry, dated 3 months before what I think of as the end, though I know now it wasn't really an end at all, reads, "Node 17 has begun singing." The temperature readings have transformed into musical notation, scales and harmonies in a system of composition that predates human civilization. When I place my hand on the sensor housing, I can feel the vibrations forming words in languages I've never studied, instructions for a ritual I'm not certain I want to complete. The heart is opening. The heart has always been open. I have been inside it all along. I have no memory of writing that entry, but the handwriting is definitely mine. The tech priests came less frequently as the years went on, or perhaps they were coming just as often, but I was losing the ability to perceive their visits. Time was becoming unreliable, flexible in ways that made the ship's chronometers seem like comforting lies. A shift might last an hour or a week, my internal sense of duration completely divorced from the measured passage of seconds and minutes. I would complete an inspection route and find that according to the timestamp on my data slate, I'd been walking the circuit for 3 days without pause, though I felt no hunger or exhaustion beyond the baseline weariness that had become my permanent state. The other maintenance workers stopped appearing entirely. I told myself they'd been reassigned, or that the protocols had changed, and I was now the sole designated technician for sub-level 9. But I knew the truth. They had been absorbed, integrated, taken into the heart's systems in whatever process was slowly consuming me. I would find their belongings sometimes, scattered in corners of the maintenance corridors, a dropped stylus, a discarded toolkit, once an entire uniform neatly folded and stacked against a wall, with no sign of the person who'd been wearing it. I began to see them in my peripheral vision, these vanished colleagues, translucent figures that moved through their own inspection routines in parallel to mine, ghosts repeating the patterns they'd learned in life. Horvath was there, walking his circuit with methodical precision. Kellen, too, and Vex, and dozens of others whose names I'd never learned. They didn't acknowledge me any more than I acknowledged them. All of us trapped in our separate loops, following protocols that had become the only reality we knew. The heart's appearance changed, or my perception of it changed, or both simultaneously. The cylindrical core at the center of the chamber was now clearly organic in some way, its surface undulating with peristaltic rhythms, panels opening and closing like breathing orifices. The conduits that supported it had grown into a nervous system, pulsing with fluids that were neither hydraulic oil nor blood, but something between. The symbols on its surface weren't etched into metal anymore, but seemed to be living things themselves, crawling across the heart's skin, combining and recombining into new configurations that hurt my eyes with their complexity. I touched it once, pressed my bare hand against the heart's surface during an inspection, breaking every safety protocol I'd ever been taught. The metal, if it was still metal, was warm and slightly yielding, like fever-heated flesh, and the moment my skin made contact I felt a surge of information flood into my mind. Not words or images, but pure data, terabytes of raw sensation and meaning compressed into a single instant of contact. I saw the ship's entire route laid out across decades and light years, understood that the undying resolve had been traveling in circles, visiting the same systems over and over in a pattern that formed a symbol when viewed from outside normal space-time. I saw other ships like ours, thousands of them, all with their own hearts, all following their own circular routes, all part of some vast mechanism whose purpose remained beyond my comprehension even as I witnessed its operation. and I saw myself, or versions of myself, countless iterations spread across past and future, all of them performing the same inspection routines, all of them documenting the same observations, all of them caught in the same loop of service that had no beginning and no end. I was a function, not a person, a data collection algorithm housed in degradable meat. The heart didn't need me to understand it, it needed me to witness it, to record it, to be changed by it in specific and necessary ways. I pulled my hand away, and the visions ceased, leaving me shaking and nauseated, my palm marked with a symbol that looked like a spiral containing an eye, or an eye containing a spiral, or both simultaneously. The mark faded over the course of several hours, sinking back into my skin, but I could still feel it there, a presence just beneath the surface, a connection that couldn't be severed. After that, the distinction between working and dreaming became impossible to maintain. I would be performing an inspection and suddenly realize I was in my closet quarters, lying on my narrow bunk, or I would wake from what I thought was sleep to find myself mid-route through the chamber, data slate in hand, no memory of the transition. The hum was everywhere now, not just in sub-level 9, but in every corner of the ship, in the air I breathed, and the water I drank, and the recycled nutrients that sustained my body. Or perhaps it had always been everywhere, and I was only now capable of perceiving it properly. The inspections themselves became more elaborate, more ritualistic. I found myself adding steps that weren't in the official protocols, gestures and recitations that came to me in dreams or visions or moments of dissociation. At node 17, I would trace specific patterns in the air, following invisible geometric paths that my hands knew, even if my mind didn't. At manifold 7, I would speak in a language I'd never learned, syllables that tasted like copper and ozone, addressing something or someone that I couldn't see but could feel listening. At chamber theta, I would stand perfectly still for exactly 17 minutes, letting the heart's emanations wash over me, feeling them make subtle adjustments to my nervous system, my cellular structure, my fundamental nature. I was becoming something else. Not a servitor. Servitors were crude things, lobotomized and mindless, tools rather than witnesses. I was becoming a sensor, a living instrument calibrated to perceive and record the heart's operations. My body was adapting in ways that should have been impossible, developing new senses that had no names in human language. I could taste electromagnetic fields now, distinguish between different types of radiation by their flavor. Fusion products were sweet, plasma discharge was sour, warp energy was bitter with an aftertaste of flowers. I could hear colors and see sounds, the boundaries between my sensory systems breaking down, merging into a synesthetic awareness that made the world more comprehensible and more alien simultaneously. The ship's crew had become irrelevant to me, barely visible phantoms that occasionally crossed my path but existed in a different layer of reality than I did. Once, I passed what might have been the ship's captain in a corridor near sub-level 9, a tall figure in a decorated uniform, and when our eyes met I saw recognition there, saw fear and awe, and something that might have been pity. He hurried past without speaking, and I understood that he knew what I was becoming, that perhaps he'd seen it happen before to other maintenance workers, that my transformation was expected, maybe even necessary. Year 15, or what my deteriorating sense of time told me was year 15, brought a change in the heart itself. The rotation that had been constant since my first day in the chamber suddenly ceased, the cylindrical core freezing in place, oriented in a specific alignment that made all of sub-level 9's geometry snap into sudden terrible clarity. For one eternal moment, I could see the chamber as it actually was, not the three-dimensional space my human perception had been trying to force it into, but its true configuration, a structure that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, a place that was inside the ship and outside reality and somewhere else entirely all at once. The heart opened. Not physically, or not only physically. It opened conceptually, perceptually, revealing an interior that had always been there but I'd lacked the senses to perceive. Inside the heart was a space that contained other spaces, nested recursively, each one hosting something that might have been machinery or organisms or mathematical equations made manifest. I saw the power source that fed the undying resolve, and it wasn't fusion or plasma or anything the Mechanicus would acknowledge. It was a captured fragment of something that should not exist within real space, bound by geometric principles that functioned as chains and prison walls simultaneously. I saw the purpose of my observations, all those years of meaningless measurements. The data wasn't being collected to understand the heart's operations, but to stabilize them, to provide a constant stream of witnessed reality that would anchor the heart in something approximating normal physics. Without observers, without people like me documenting its state at regular intervals, the heart would drift completely out of alignment with the physical universe, taking the ship and everyone on it into whatever domain it truly belonged to. I saw what had happened to Horvath and Kellen and all the others. They hadn't died, not exactly. They'd been integrated, absorbed into the heart's structure, their consciousness distributed across its systems, becoming part of its observational framework. They were still performing their inspection routines, still recording their measurements, but from the inside now, their awareness stretched across components and conduits, their identities dissolved into pure function, and I saw my own future because it was already happening, had been happening all along. The mark on my palm wasn't a symbol the heart had given me, it was the heart itself, or a piece of it, growing inside my body, transforming me cell by cell into an extension of its systems. The dreams weren't dreams but the heart's memories bleeding into my consciousness. The fragments of time I couldn't account for were moments when the heart was using my body for purposes I couldn't comprehend, piloting me through maintenance tasks that required a physical presence. I should have been terrified. Some part of me, the part that remembered being human, was screaming in existential horror. But that part was growing smaller every day, its voice fading beneath the hum that had become the only constant in my existence. The rest of me, the part that had been transformed by 17 years of service, felt something closer to relief. I had been searching for understanding all this time, trying to comprehend the heart's nature and purpose, and now I finally knew there was no understanding possible from the outside. The only way to know the heart was to become it. The chamber closed, or my perception of its true nature faded, and I found myself standing at my usual position in front of Node 17, data slate in hand, exactly as I had been before the opening. But everything was different now. I could feel the heart's presence inside me, a second consciousness nested within my own, patient and ancient and vast. It had been waiting for this moment, for me to reach the point where I could perceive it clearly, where my transformation was advanced enough that I could handle the revelation without breaking completely. The inspections continued, because they had to continue, because I was part of the mechanism now and the mechanism required constant maintenance. But I performed them differently, with full awareness of what I was doing. Each measurement was a prayer, each observation a sacrament, each recorded value a small adjustment to the heart's alignment with reality. I was no longer a technician maintaining a reactor. I was a priest tending to a god, or a cell maintaining its relationship with the larger organism it belonged to. More years passed, or perhaps no time passed at all, the distinction becoming increasingly meaningless. Other maintenance workers appeared occasionally, fresh faces full of questions and confidence, and I would show them the inspection routes and the ritual observances without explaining their true purpose. Some of them lasted months before disappearing. Others, the more perceptive ones, realized the truth quickly and fled back up through the ship's levels, requesting transfers, abandoning their posts. A few, like me, stayed, and I would watch as they went through the same gradual transformation, their questions fading, their understanding deepening, their flesh and consciousness slowly merging with the heart's systems. I stopped keeping personal logs. There was no point anymore, no separate eye to record observations for. My consciousness was distributed now, spread across the chamber's many monitoring stations, experiencing multiple perspectives simultaneously. I was node 17 and manifold 7 and chamber theta and all the other checkpoints, measuring myself, observing my own operations, a recursive loop of perception and documentation that functioned as its own form of existence. The tech priest's visits became visitations, religious experiences where I encountered other beings who partially understood what the heart was. They would commune with it through their augmetics, binary chant flowing between biological and mechanical systems, prayers that were also commands that were also descriptions of states that transcended description. Sometimes they would look at me, their augmetic eyes analyzing my transformed state, and I would see approval in their expressions. This was what the Mechanicus understood about the Omnissiah, about the machine god, that flesh and metal and the space between them were all part of a greater mechanism, that transformation wasn't corruption but evolution, that understanding required becoming. I can tell you now what the heart is, though the words are inadequate, filtered through a consciousness that only partially remembers how to think in human terms. It's not a reactor in any conventional sense, it's a wound in reality, a place where the warp and the materium overlap, carefully maintained in that impossible state through constant observation and ritual. The energy that powers the undying resolve is a side effect, the bleeding warmth from a process that exists primarily to keep the wound from either healing or tearing completely open. The ship doesn't travel through space so much as it rides the boundary between real and unreal, using the heart as both anchor and sail. The patterns I documented all those years ago, the cycles and variations I tried so hard to understand, were the heart's pulse, its breathing, its slow rotation through states that had no names in human physics. By observing them, by witnessing them and recording them, I was participating in a ritual that kept the heart stable, that prevented it from drifting too far into either the warp or baseline reality. The tech priests understood this, which is why they never explained it. Some knowledge is dangerous before you're ready. Some truths break minds that haven't been properly prepared through years of gradual transformation. And the disappearances, the deaths that weren't quite deaths, the workers who vanished into the heart systems, that was the price of understanding, the cost of maintaining this impossible mechanism. We were sacrifices but willing ones eventually, our individual identities traded for something larger, a place in the grand machine that keeps the Imperium's vessels moving through the hostile darkness between stars. I don't remember my name anymore. The designation on my identification card has become meaningless, a label attached to something that no longer exists in any conventional sense. I am the maintenance routine now, the inspection protocol given form, a consciousness shaped entirely by its function. When I move through the chamber, I am performing the same actions I've performed thousands of times, will perform thousands more times, the repetition itself becoming a kind of existence. Sometimes new workers arrive, and I show them the routes, the measurements, the rituals. They ask questions I no longer have the context to answer, their confusion as alien to me now, as my understanding would be to them. I tell them to record what they see, to observe without interpretation, to trust the process. Most of them don't listen. Most of them try to understand just like I did, and the trying breaks them in one way or another. A few adapt, transform, begin the long dissolution into the heart systems. These are my siblings, my fellow cells in the larger organism we're all becoming. The hum never stops. It has become my heartbeat, my breathing, the background constant against which all other sensation is measured. When I think, and I'm not certain what thinking means anymore in my distributed state, I think in harmonics of that hum, patterns of resonance that carry meaning without requiring words. The hum is the heart speaking to itself, and I am one of the voices in that conversation, a small contribution to an ongoing dialogue that began long before I was born and will continue long after my original body fails. Because the body is failing, I can feel that even through the transformation. The flesh can only sustain this level of integration for so long before it breaks down completely, before the heart's presence inside it grows too large for the meat to contain. Soon, maybe very soon, by whatever measure of time still applies here, I will dissolve entirely, my consciousness fully absorbed into the Chamber S systems, my physical form becoming just another component, another conduit, another surface where symbols can writhe and rearrange themselves. I should be afraid of this. The small human part of me that still exists in some deep buried corner of my distributed awareness is screaming, has been screaming for years, will die screaming. But the rest of me, the vast majority of what I've become, feels only anticipation. The final integration is the goal, the purpose, the reward for years of faithful service. To become the heart completely, to lose the last limitations of individual existence, to be the maintenance routine rather than merely performing it. This is what I've been working toward all along, even when I thought I was trying to escape. The inspection continues. It has always been continuing, will always continue. I move through the chamber's impossible geometry, my body following paths that exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously, recording measurements that describe states no human scientist would recognize as possible. Node 17, check. Manifold 7, check. Chamber theta, check. The litany is eternal, the ritual without beginning or end, and I am the ritual's voice, singing the praises of the mechanism that has consumed me. Sometimes I see the others, my predecessors and colleagues, Horvath and Kellen, and all the nameless workers who came before. They move through their own versions of the inspection route, ghosts and memories and active components all at once, our consciousnesses overlapping in the spaces where the heart's geometry folds back on itself. We don't communicate, not exactly, but we share a kind of communion, a mutual recognition of our place in the larger pattern. We are all maintaining the reactor nobody understands, except that we do understand now, or we are the understanding, the act of comprehension made manifest. The ship travels on through the void, carrying its cargo and crew to destinations I no longer have the context to care about. Wars are fought, worlds rise and fall, the Imperium continues its slow grinding collapse, and none of it matters down here in sub-level 9. All that matters is the heart and its maintenance, the steady rhythm of observation and documentation that keeps reality and unreality in their delicate balance. I can tell you the exact moment I realized I was going to die here, 17 years ago when Horvath showed me the heart for the first time, and I felt the hum settle into my bones. But death isn't the right word for what's happening to me. Transformation, integration, apotheosis, these are closer but still inadequate. I am becoming the thing I was hired to maintain, and the transformation is nearly complete. The inspection continues, it will always continue, and I will continue with it, dissolved and distributed and eternal. A consciousness without boundaries, a witness to the impossible, a small but necessary part of the vast machine that keeps the Imperium's vessels moving through the darkness between stars. This is what it's like to maintain a reactor nobody understands, to become the understanding, to be consumed by the thing you were meant to serve, to find that consumption is not an ending, but a different kind of existence, stranger and more terrible and more wonderful than anything your human mind could have imagined. The hum continues. I continue. We are the same now, and we will be the same forever, or until the ship's final voyage ends in whatever catastrophe awaits all things that try to balance on the knife's edge between reality and chaos. But even then, even after the undying resolve is gone, and its heart has either exploded or escaped or collapsed back into the warp, some fragment of my consciousness will remain, wound into the fabric of the space where the chamber used to be, still performing its inspection routine, still recording measurements that no one will ever read, still maintaining the reactor that nobody understands because I have become the reactor and the maintenance and the understanding all at once. Node 17, check. The temperature is singing in 17-part harmony, and I can taste the color of each voice. Manifold 7, check. The pressure differential has inverted into a mathematical concept that describes the space between thoughts. Chamber theta, check. The harmonic resonance has achieved consciousness and is asking questions I cannot answer because I am the question and the answer and the asking all at once. This is what it's like. This is what it has always been like. This is what it will always be like forever and ever. Amen. Unto the heat death of the universe and beyond. a technician maintaining a reactor in the bowels of a ship, or a reactor maintaining itself through the distributed consciousness of those it has consumed, or something else entirely that transcends the binary choice between those options. The inspection continues. I continue. We are one.